Welcome to This Old Democracy, a regular podcast where we explore the ideas, movements, and people working to rescue our faltering political system and rebuild American democracy on a stronger, more inclusive, and more representative foundation. I'm your host, Micah Sifry, and I've been on this beat for a long time, from taking on the problem of money in politics, to writing a book about third parties, to tracking how the internet is shaking everything up, and more recently joining the fight against rising authoritarianism. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Center for Ballot Freedom, a cross-partisan nonprofit dedicated to strengthening democracy. Today, we're talking with Perry Bacon, a columnist for the Washington Post who writes frequently on American politics and a longtime observer of the political scene. Welcome to This Old Democracy, Perry.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. Appreciate you making the time. So let's dive right in. It's a crazy time, and there are a lot of people worrying that democracy in America is on the way out, if it's not already gone and lost. Tell me, how bad do you think the situation is, for starters?
You know, when I look at a president who is threatening news organizations and getting them to sort of do payoffs to him functionally in order to merge, or when I look at how he's forcing college presidents to resign, I do think things are pretty bad. I think, defining is democracy over? Of course not. But I think the question is, are we sliding in the wrong direction? Is obvious as well. We are going, if you think of democracy as a continuum as opposed to a binary, then I think we're going in an anti-democratic direction pretty rapidly these last 5 months.
Sure. Though, historically speaking, it's not like we were such a great democracy for so long that we're losing something that we had in such a strong way. I mean, there are many people who would say that it wasn't until the passage of the Voting Rights Act that America even began to become a democracy for all of its citizens. But tell me, do you think there's something really different and worse about this second Trump term that is keeping you up at night?
How they are taking on independent institutions, civil society. I mentioned universities. I mentioned the media. I think there's that idea they're defunding. We saw the administration cut $7 billion of funding from education sort of on its own last week, for example. So the flouting Congress. Cutting funds that Congress already appropriated, ignoring judicial rulings. I think things are worse than they were 4 years ago in terms of Trump behaving more of it like an autocrat and ignoring other parts of government, ignoring civil society, ignoring any kinds of rules on his power.
Okay, fair enough. So tell me, do you think, you've written a lot of, many of your columns look at what the opposition, or let's say, the people who would hopefully protect democracy are doing or need to be doing, ranging from the Democratic Party leadership all the way out to the resistance, or whatever word you want to use for the folks who've been out in the streets. So do you think that people are doing enough? Do you think that something's missing? What's your view on how you see that whole constellation of forces? Because there was a lot, in Trump's first term, and there seems to be a lot now too. So how do you see it?
By some measures, we're having more protests from rank and file Americans than we did 8 years ago. So I think the American people who care about democracy are coming to protest, are active, and I think that part is fine. What I'm most concerned about is the other parts of what I would call civil society, the other institutions that should rein in a radical president. The Supreme Court seems to be rolling over. In 2017, we had the John McCains and the Mitt Romneys in Congress, and maybe John McCain was in 2017, Romney came later.
Yeah.
You had more of the old guard Republicans in Congress who felt like, I'm a member of Congress and we're the first branch of government, we're the first of the Constitution, versus they've all sort of rolled over this time. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell were much more confrontational when Trump ignored them. I think so. Congress and the Supreme Court have given up their role in a lot of ways. I think the business community has been really poor here. You saw all these law firms early on, universities sort of folding preemptively. So I think the other institutions, the media has folded. A lot of news organizations deciding to cut deals with Trump. I'm talking about ABC News, talking about CBS News, the president of CBS, so the head of CBS and Paramount forcing out leadership of 60 Minutes. So I see a lot of the institutions that should be, the voters I think are doing fine. The institutions I think are not.
Right. So do you have a diagnosis or a theory for why that is? What has allowed so many of our civil institutions to get that weak? I mean, I want to get into the underlying, what you think of as the underlying reasons for this crisis. And we'll come back in a moment to the role of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Let's stay on the civil society part of it first. Why are they rolling over?
So part of it is like purely what I would say is capitalism on some level. Like if you want, like Trump, like a lot of news organizations in this era are part of big mega conglomerates who want to. So when you have a merger deal, the government has to agree to a merger. So if you want to merge, so a lot of these big television companies want to merge with other companies or be bought out, and Trump holds the keys to that. So if you soften your coverage, he lets you merge. And so I think there's an obvious part of it that is like the capital structure that is important. I also just think a lot of our institutions, when I think at parts of academia, I think parts of the business community, do not have a great sense of sort of moral leadership on some level. Like, and I would say that on some levels, like they want to be nonpartisan, but you can be for democracy, you can be for equality, you can be for voting rights. Those should not be thought of as being partisan values. But I think these institutions have no values at all. And I think what you're seeing is their only value is survival. Yeah. And I think the other thing is you see is certain kinds of institutions today just aren't very strong. Like I wish we had a stronger religious community, or stronger, the fact that fewer Americans are going to church, fewer Americans are members of labor unions. So I think some institutions that used to be strong in the past are just weaker themselves. And so even if their criticism of Trump's don't matter because they don't represent any real constituency beyond their few leaders. So I think when labor was stronger, that would have helped. Like labor right now is like less than 10% of the country. So few Americans go to church at this point. So I think we have institutions we think of as being strong are actually very weak right now.
Yes. There's a book called The Hollow Parties, which came out last year, and Sam Rosenfeld and Schlossman, I'm blanking on his first name for the moment, Daniel Schlossman. But I think what they argue about the parties, it sounds like could also apply to civil society, the hollowing out, the weakening of these intermediary institutions that have always played a role in the moral fiber of the country in responding to crises. And I think you're probably right that they are weaker. And this is of great concern to me as well. Let's go back to the role of the political parties. Someone who we had on the podcast recently, Lee Drutman, the political scientist at New America, makes the argument that first of all, that we need our political parties to be healthy. That they're absolutely vital institutions. They are what can bring citizens together in common purpose at scale across the entire country to achieve an agenda, and that organized parties are always a critical piece of a healthy democracy. a country with only one party, it's definitely not a democracy. And today we have two parties, one that has clearly been captured by a very strong faction, the MAGA faction. So people like Mitt Romney and so on have no place in today's Republican Party. And they seem to be homeless or retired. And then there's the Democrats, which is this very big, fractious coalition where there are at least two, if not more, factions at war with each other. And they can never neither one is strong enough to dominate the Democratic Party the way MAGA dominates the Republican Party. And we're in this very kind of stuck place where both parties do a very good job of demonizing the other one, right? Like we're all part of a team now. Either you're on the red team or the blue team, and everything that happens gets filtered through that lens of, is it good for my team or does it hurt the other team? Do you agree with that? Do you see us as stuck in that kind? Lee calls it the two-party doom loop, right? Because it keeps getting worse. How do you relate to that? Does that make sense to you?
I would probably frame it a little differently, which is I think at this point we have one party that is, I would say, more anti-democratic than the other. The Republican Party is more radical and more extreme, I would say. But the problem becomes I would say we want all of our leaders to respect election results, for example. Let's say that as a basic premise for democracy, you need the leaders to respect election results. So if you have one party that doesn't respect election results and you only have two parties, then you basically have to have a lot of the arguments we hear is basically democracy can only remain if Democrats win elections. Think about that for a second. That's a problem. It's like, so to me, that's the problem is we only have two parties. One of them is tending toward anti-democracy. So we've put so we have elections in which basically the Democratic message at times, the Democratic Party is democracy will only be defended if we win. So basically we have to win no matter what we say. And so that's a problem too. So to me, the problem is the Republican Party's gotten radical and we only have two parties. And so the solution, I think, gets closer to where I think we're headed to. You need to have the Republican Party get more normal. You need to have more parties too. But I would argue is a very important thing right now. So I think that's the issue is that I agree that there's too much partisanship, but I actually think right now I would not want to draw an equivalency. One party's gotten more radical than the other, and we don't have any mechanisms to address the problem right now.
And the partisanship isn't necessarily bad either, right? Like it helps people clarify, is this someone I want to vote for or not? The problem is when it becomes zero sum and there are only two parties. Countries that have more than two parties, what happens a lot is they get used to forming coalitions. So they don't demonize, even if they don't agree on a whole bunch of things with some other party, they maybe realize they also have to form a coalition with them if they're going to get into power or if they're going to be a strong opposition. And so you don't see quite as much nasty polarization in those places. You wrote a really, really interesting piece last year. I think it was before the election and probably in part inspired by that race in Nebraska, where an independent named Dan Osborne, a labor leader, but not a Democrat, ran for Senate. And the Democratic Party in that state basically stood down. They didn't put up a candidate, and they kind of allowed a path for him. And he did much better than expected, right? And then you wrote this piece arguing that maybe it's time for more parties in the places where either the Republican Party is really weak or the Democratic Party is really weak. Tell me, I'd love to talk to you more about that. Where did that idea come from? Did you get, what kind of feedback did you get from it? Do you think it has legs?
So short answer, no. But longer answer, I guess, might be, the Dan Osborne ran, I think, in Nebraska, probably ran, I think, 10 points ahead of Harris in Nebraska and statewide. So it was a competitive race. And so what really inspired me to write the piece was I live in Kentucky. So I live in Louisville, which is more left of center, but I live in Kentucky, which is very Republican. And so statewide elections in Kentucky are not very competitive. I know Andy Beshear is the governor here. He won kind of a fluke, but in general, U.S. Senate races, Attorney General races, the Republican candidate is going to win no matter what. We live in a one-party state, and a lot of people live in a one-party state. There's a Democratic one. Illinois is closer, but like if you talk about mayor's races, particularly, if you talk about Chicago, Boston, a Republican is never going to win the mayor's race in those places. So if you look across the country, you have a ton of elections where the general election is not competitive at all. So we have a democracy, but on election day, most of the time you have no actual choice because the person you vote for either is going to win or get slaughtered. Yeah. And so that was part of it to me was in Kentucky, my guess is putting the D beside your name drops you 10 points automatically. So and if you're running for mayor in Boston, putting an R beside your name is probably the opposite. So is there some way the idea was essentially should the no chance party, and it's going to be hard to create formal parties across time, but in individual races, should the no chance party in a given area say, okay, we have no chance, concede that, and let some kind of independent person run. So in Nebraska, you need a person who's going to get most of the Democratic vote, but can also get some independents and Republicans. So they can't call themselves a Democrat, but they have to appeal to some Democrats. If you're running for mayor in Boston, it had to be a Republican-ish, a person who would get the 20% of Republicans, but also could appeal to the 80% of people who are Democrats. That's the kind of concept there. Will that work? I don't know. It'd be better than what we have now, which is basically like I get up election day and have nothing to vote for, and I know who's going to win the races the moment the Republican primary is finished.
Yeah, and one of the in Kentucky, but and I live in New York, which is relatively speaking a blue dominant state, or there are certainly parts of New York, New York City, where people register as Democrats because that's where all the election is going to be decided in the Democratic primary. And one of the effects of this also is to stifle the paths to new ideas, new leadership. You can only come up through one channel, and that channel is, if you're an ambitious political entrepreneur, or you've got an issue that you cannot get that party to pay attention to, you're so much for having democracy. I think you're right that this is to many people it could be a turnoff in general to say, well, you talk about democracy, but it isn't really that much of a democracy for me where I live. So the organization that co-sponsors this podcast, the Center for Ballot Freedom, what we're trying to do is get back to a system of multi-party democracy like the one that we used to have in America and throughout the 1800s. But that's when the party system was more open, and you had smaller parties that could fuse, that could cross-endorse the candidates of major parties. Sometimes they ran their own candidates when they really felt they had a chance to win, but very often they leveraged the support they had. This is like the abolitionist movement, for example. The anti-slavery movement in America in the 1840s was confronted with two major parties that both supported slavery, but they found a pathway up through that system because they could run candidates on their line and demonstrate that there were significant support for abolition or something less pro-slavery, let's be clear. And that is how the party system shifted. We don't have that now, but that's the thing we're trying to bring back. Does that make sense to you?
So proportional representation, fusion voting, I agree with these ideas. I don't know how we get there because both parties, the people who vote on things are usually in one part or the other. They have the two parties, the leadership of the two parties is very invested in this, in maintaining their power, even though I'm pretty liberal on issues, but even I would prefer to. I want to have. I'm guessing my views are. I have almost all my views are closer to the Democrats and the Republicans. Even then, I'd prefer a more open system because it would just because I think we have very few ideas. We have stale parties. It's hard to get through. So even I, as a pretty liberal person, would prefer a more open system, but I just don't know. In other words, what I'm trying to get at is it's not that the average Democrat or the average Republican is opposed to changes. It's the people in power who currently hold the seats have very little incentive to change the system, even though my guess is when you do polls on do you want more parties, you get overwhelming majorities of people are for multi-party. This is not just this is an issue where the people want more parties, the leaders don't, and we have to be better at get the internet across, but it's not the average person. Even highly partisan ideological people want more choices.
Do you think so? We're speaking on July 9th. It's a few days after Elon Musk has announced that he's forming a new third party called the America Party. Yeah, I saw you roll your eyes. Yeah, what do you think? I mean, people are talking about it because it's Elon Musk and he has just slightly less money than God. But you roll your eyes.
Well, there's two reasons. The first is that I would argue we want structured systemic multi-parties, not one rich guy gets to create a party in his image. I would want to have proportional representation, fusion voting, things that like New York has fusion voting, New York City I know does. And so I want to have it where it's like ground up, not one rich guy. Also, I would argue Elon Musk's views are not unrepresented in politics. The idea that we should have lower taxes and less regulation is shared by, I would argue in some ways by two parties, but certainly by the Republican Party that he helped fund pretty recently. I mean, I think the one thing, if he were, let me be constructive for a second. If he were really, if you were trying to think about Elon Musk, my sense is his views are kind of what I would call is blue state Republican. My guess is he's for gay marriage, he's for abortion rights, but he's against big government, he's against regulation. So if Elon Musk said, I'm going to fund an alternative party that's going to run races in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, all the big cities that are which you have basically one party elections where the Democrat wins. Elon Musk says, I'm going to form the reasonable liberalism party. Let's go with that for now. And it's going to compete in the 20 bluest areas. That would not be, and I would prefer it not be funded by Elon Musk, but I think that would actually be a pretty decent reform. Versus in my piece, what I get at here in Kentucky, you would want the opposite, which is like you'd want a party that was, Kentucky is a pretty poor state. Medicaid spending is very popular here. What you'd want to have is a party that is probably, in Kentucky, the alternative would be probably for big government and for unions, for Medicaid, but also maybe a little bit more socially conservative. Maybe it's for some abortion limitations, like that sort of Elon Musk wants
public
a
funding for churches.
fiscally conservative.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, well, we can debate whether that's exactly right, but yeah, something like that. In other words, Elon Musk wants a fiscal conservative, social liberal. Kentucky might want a social conservative, fiscal liberal, but you get but I like the idea of having more choices, and no matter how we get there, I think we do need more choices.
Yeah, well, we agree about that. Tell me, as we bring this to a close, I've been asking everybody the same question at the end of each conversation. These are really tough times. And I know, Perry, you're bringing up a daughter. I saw in one of your columns, you have a young daughter. So thank you for believing in the future. But what gives you hope? Tell me, personally, how do you maintain hope in a very difficult period?
So I guess two things. I guess, first of all, my father was born in 1950, so it's hard for me to, at a time in which there was segregation and his opportunities were limited. So I would say the first thing is like, in the history of America, I have far more opportunities than he did, and the country was going in a pretty positive direction, and it can return there. Like, America, we have these ups and downs, and maybe we're in a down period, but we have had women's equality, Black equality, immigrant equality. We've had these movements that have come up, and I would argue we had a pretty strong movement. Black Lives Matter was talking about African Americans, but it was also talking about a broader society that was more equitable and more equal, making it easier to go to college, making it easier to having a more funded public sector for jobs. We just had a movement, and also the police reform. We just had a pretty positive movement that ended was going 5 years ago. So in some ways, I think of the possibilities of America are there to. It's not as if the average Democrat, the average American wants Donald Trump to be defunding colleges and the news media. If you poll these things, they're not very popular. There are a lot of Republicans who maybe are Republicans but don't like everything he's doing. So in some ways, I'm optimistic because I can see that there's possibility. Everyone that doesn't agree, the bad things that are happening are not things people are cheering on. Right. They're not sure how to stop them, but it's not as clear. If we can get out of this doom loop, in some ways we can solve some of these bigger problems. So the main thing is like looking at our history is the first thing, and then looking at is the first part is we have gone through bad moments and we have gotten better as a country, and maybe we're in an 1856 moment, or we're going to have a real big fissure to get there. I don't know. Or maybe we're more in 1963 where some laws passed and that things change. I don't know. I'm not a historian. I'm not a predictor of the future for sure. But that's where I start from. And second, I see a lot of people working on the issues too. You mentioned Lee Drutman, who's been writing for like 10 years about the party doom loop and how we need more parties. And I think we have a lot of people who are really thinking. I would mention Leah Greenberg and Ezra Levin, who run the group Indivisible, which is really, which is liberal, but is really focused more on how do we preserve our democracy. They're much more focused. And so I see a lot of great people thinking and acting and achieving things day to day. It's not as they're not stopping Trump, but I do think I see a lot of good work happening. And so when I look at that work, I think, okay, we're trying, and I think that's an important thing. We're not succeeding, but lots of us are trying, and we should notice when there are good things that are happening, even if we are in a period where I think most things that are happening are bad.
Amen to that. I hear you. And I think that works for me a lot too. Well, thank you, Perry. That's it for this episode of This Old Democracy. If you found today's conversation thought-provoking, please share with a friend, leave us a review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about our work and our partners at the Center for Ballot Freedom, visit centerforballotfreedom.org. I'm Micah Sifry, and I'll be back soon with more stories of the people and ideas fighting to renew, repair, and rebuild our democracy because it's ours and it's worth saving. Thanks for listening, and stay engaged.